Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Black, will open the Senate with prayer.
Let us pray. O God, you are our God. We can stay composed even in a storm because of your presence. We need you and stay thirsty for you. For your power and glory uplift us. Your steadfast love is our reason for being, and we will bless your name for as long as we live. Lord, empower our senators to run toward life's challenges and hardships, knowing that they are never alone. Satisfy their souls with good things and transform the mundane into the meaningful. Draw them close to you as you purify their hearts and provide them with a spirit of hope. We pray in your loving name. Amen.
Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
1 minute for morning business, please.
Without objection.
Across Iowa this weekend, farmers will be in their fields as they continue the 2020 harvest season. Iowa farmers have now harvested all but about 10% of our soybeans and 30% of our corn. Because I am in Washington, D.C. this weekend with the confirmation of Judge Barrett, I won't be able to give my social media followers my weekly update on the 2020 hashtag Corn Watch or hashtag Soybean Watch series from the Grassley Farm. The purpose of this weekly series is to give people who have never stepped foot on a farm an idea of the complexities that go into planting, growing, and harvesting a bountiful crop. Between COVID-19 supply chain disruptions, also drought, also the derecho, the 86,000 Iowa farm families have faced one of the most challenging years in recent memory. Farmers are only 2% of the population, but they provide food, fuel, and fiber for the other 98%. I want to send my best wishes to farmers and their families as we are nearing the final stretch of the harvest season. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Yesterday, the Senate took the first step toward concluding our consideration of Judge Amy Coney Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court. The judge is one of the most brilliant, admired, and impressive nominees for any public office in a generation. Tomorrow, we'll vote on advancing our nomination toward final confirmation on Monday. Our recent debates have been heated, but curiously, talk of Judge Barrett's actual credentials or qualifications has hardly featured in it. The Democratic leader summarized his view yesterday, quote, he said, "It's not about qualifications." His words. Instead, our Democratic colleagues have tried to claim the Senate's process itself is not legitimate. These claims are supposed to lay groundwork for radical, institution-wrecking changes down the road. But of course, they're not true. We live in a constitutional republic. The legitimacy of an outcome does not depend on the feelings it provokes in politicians. Let me say that again. The legitimacy of an outcome does not depend on the feelings it provokes in politicians. Legitimacy comes from precedents, rules, and ultimately the Constitution. So let's restate a few facts for posterity. Number one, there is no inconsistency between the Republican Senate's decision in 2016 and our decision to confirm Judge Barrett this year. Here's what I said in my very first floor speech following the death of Justice Scalia, quoting myself. The Senate has not filled a vacancy arising in an election year when there was divided government since 1888, almost 130 years ago. Not setting some new precedent, just stating a fact. 15 times in American history, during a presidential election year, new Supreme Court vacancies have arisen and presidents have made nominations. 7 of the 15 times, voters had elected an opposite party Senate to check and balance the sitting president. Not surprisingly, in those situations, only 2 of the 7 were confirmed, and none since 1888. The other 8 times, the same party controlled the Senate and the White House. 7 of those 8 were confirmed, all but 1. The one exception unraveled in a scandal. We followed precedent in 2016, and we're following precedent this week. Number 2, it's been claimed that Chairman Graham broke the rules by reporting out Judge Barrett's nomination. Not so. As the parliamentarian confirmed on Thursday, Standing Rule 26 and Senate precedent are crystal clear. If a majority of a committee is physically present and votes in favor of a nomination, reporting it to the floor is a valid action, irrespective of what committee rules may say. And Chairman Graham didn't even violate the rules of his own committee. Past chairmen of both parties have done precisely what Chairman Graham did on Thursday morning. In 2014, for one example, Chairman Leahy and the committee's Democratic majority voted multiple federal judges to the floor without 2 members of the minority present, just a few years ago. Nothing remotely unprecedented took place. Not in committee, not on the floor. Number 3, timing. Some colleagues kept repeating the absurd claim that this is the most rushed confirmation process in history. Well, Mr. President, that's flat out false. From the announcement of the nomination to the start of hearings, 8 Supreme Court nominations in the last 60 years moved more quickly than this one. 8 in the last 60 years moved more quickly than this one. Then, from the end of the hearing to the committee vote, half of all confirmations since 1916 actually moved faster than this one. Justice John Paul Stevens was confirmed in 19 days, from start to finish. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in about 4 weeks. In the past, justices have been confirmed in 1 week, some in 1 day. There's no argument that Judge Barrett's nomination has moved at some breakneck pace. Facts are facts. Number 4, contrary to what's been claimed, the Senate has absolutely confirmed Supreme Court nominees later in presidential election years than this one. Multiple justices were confirmed after elections had already happened. We've had multiple Supreme Court justices confirmed in December of election years. Senates have even confirmed nominees for lame duck presidents who just lost. So another non-issue. So look, all of these false claims embarrass those who repeat them, but the most important point is this. In this country, legitimacy does not flow from the whims of politicians. Legitimacy does not depend on which political party makes a decision. Legitimacy comes from traditions, rules, and the Constitution. Our Democratic colleagues have spent months obsessively demanding that our president repeatedly acknowledge that the election will be legitimate even if he loses. But here in the Senate, here, with this confirmation process, Democrats are flunking their own test. So let me say that again. Democrats want President Trump to keep repeating that the election will be legitimate regardless of whether he wins. But here in the Senate, the very same people are saying that our vote on Monday will only be valid if they like the outcome. Our republic cannot abide any political faction making illegitimate a sloppy synonym for "we're not happy." Well, of course they're not happy. That doesn't make anything about this illegitimate. That kind of recklessness, Mr. President, leads down a road none of us should want to travel. So that's why I keep correcting the record. Even though it might seem silly, after all, if Republicans have the votes, why not just ignore my colleagues' misstatements and move on? But I've chosen not to do that. It remains our duty to separate right from wrong, fact from fiction, for the good of the Senate and for our country. Judge Barrett's confirmation process has followed every rule. It's followed the Constitution in every respect. We have abided by the norms and traditions dictated by our history. And, Mr. President, we're going to vote tomorrow. I suggest they have the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President,
Democrat leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Well, Mr. President, I just heard the Republican leader say there is no inconsistency between what Republicans are doing now with Amy Coney Barrett's nomination and what they did with Merrick Garland in 2016. Who would believe that? The contradiction is glaring. The contradiction will be a stain on the leader's forehead and on the entire Republican caucus if it continues. We just heard another warped, distorted, and convoluted history lesson from Leader McConnell. We know how defensive he is about the blatant 180-degree hypocritical turn he has made on Supreme Court nominations. But a distorted, warped history lesson will not remove the stain. Only one thing will, Leader McConnell: withdraw the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett till after the election. Plain and simple. Now, we meet here on a rare Saturday session because there's nothing remotely normal about the Republican drive to confirm Judge Barrett to the Supreme Court only days before a presidential election. 4 years ago, the entire Republican Senate said it was a principle, that was their word, principle, that Supreme Court justices should not be confirmed in presidential election years. Leader McConnell said, quote, "The American people deserve a choice in the selection of their next Supreme Court justice," unquote. That is the principle they insisted the Senate must follow. And they declared that this principle bound the Senate not to consider the nomination of Judge Garland, even though it was 8 months before the presidential election of 2016. Well, here we are today, just a few days from another presidential election. More than 50 million Americans have already voted. That number will only increase between today and Monday, the date of Judge Barrett's confirmation vote. Americans are waiting in line now, patiently, at early voting locations around the country to cast their ballots. In Arizona and North Carolina, Maine and Colorado, and Iowa and Kansas and Georgia and Alaska and Kentucky. In 26 states where early voting centers are open, and another 15 states where early votes can be dropped off at election offices. In my home state of New York, where today marks the first day of early voting. It may look a little different this year. The lines are longer, not just because of enthusiasm, but also because they're more socially distant. Everyone should be wearing a mask. But as we speak, millions of Americans are using their voices to say who they want to select Supreme Court justices. At the same time, the Republican majority in the Senate is ramming through the lifetime appointment of a justice, who will make hugely impactful decisions about their lives and freedom. And Leader McConnell has the temerity to say there is no contradiction between Merrick Garland and how they treated him and Amy Coney Barrett and how they're treating her. Give me a break. Our colleagues are saying to the American people, you get no say. You get no choice. 4 years ago, when a Democratic president nominated a justice, Republicans professed to care about giving the American people a voice. Not so now. Not when a Republican-nominated justice is on the line. Not when their own political power is at stake. What became of that high-minded principle Republican senators embraced so fervently in somber tones just 4 years ago, when Leader McConnell and they told the nation the Senate must heed the voices of American people when they vote? Where on earth did that principle go? What principles govern their current mad rush to confirm another Trump justice 8 days before this presidential election? If this process has revealed anything, is the supposed Republican principle was a farce. No principle at all, and never was. Naked opportunism. A transparent, cynical, last-ditch grab for power. And of course, the continuation of their shameful lockstep subservience to President Trump, the most unprincipled president in American history. This will go down as the most partisan, most hypocritical, and least legitimate Supreme Court confirmation in our nation's history. And once again, Leader McConnell, what you talk about history, a distorted, one-sided view, that's all you give, it doesn't erase what you have done. It stares the American people in the face. They know it, we all know it, and history will know it. It's a very dark moment for the Senate. And I am ashamed that Republicans are going along with this. This, again, will be the most partisan, most hypocritical, and least legitimate Supreme Court confirmation in our nation's history. And now let's look at the status of our country. It's even less justified in light of that. We had a record number of COVID infections yesterday. Let me repeat, a record number. Are Senate Republicans doing anything about that? No. This is not a regional crisis like before. These spikes are now widespread across the whole country, putting all of our nations at risk. In fact, in per capita terms, I believe North and South Dakota are the highest in the nation. I read this morning that beds are running out, and we're not doing a thing. In the past month, there's been a 35% increase in the number of Americans hospitalized with COVID. COVID is now the third leading cause of death in the United States. In countries like Germany and Japan and Australia, COVID isn't close to the top 10. Experts, like Dr. Fauci, are projecting that we could hit 400,000 American deaths this year, and that the darkest and worst days of this pandemic, unfortunately, are ahead of us, not behind us. The next huge wave in this pandemic is not looming, it's here. We cannot afford to wait. But are Republicans doing anything about it? No. There are tens of millions of Americans out of work. Businesses are failing every day. Are Senate Republicans doing anything about that? No. There are foreign powers, particularly Russia, trying to undermine our elections. Are Republicans doing anything about that? No. They are too focused on implementing their deeply unpopular agenda through the courts, because they know they could never get it through the Senate. Most of them wouldn't even vote for it. Today, we're going to give the Republican majority in the Senate the opportunity to consider critical legislation that has so far languished in Leader McConnell's legislative graveyard. Many bills that are just sitting here awaiting action that were passed in the House, many with bipartisan support, are sitting waiting for Senate action. We should be doing that, not rushing through this nomination while people are voting and want their choice listened to, not their choice, not the Republican Senate choice. So, we're going to start with comprehensive legislation that addresses the most serious problems facing America right now, the HEROES Act, which would deliver urgent and necessary relief to the nation and the people who are suffering. The HEROES Act would have a comprehensive regime for testing and tracing, $75 billion, the money that's needed, that this administration never gave. In fact, there's $9 billion sitting there from what we approved months ago in the CARES Act that they haven't even given out yet, and so incompetent are they. I saw Donald Trump in the debate. He says, oh, it'll go away. He's been saying that since January. That's why people know he's an incompetent president during the most difficult of times. And yet, he still says it. We need that money. We need money to open up our schools safely and soundly. That takes extra money. The school districts can't afford it. Ventilation, more buses, PPE, oftentimes more teachers, hotspots so people can get the Wi-Fi when they don't have it in their own homes, and so many more. That's in the bill. Money to prevent people from being evicted from their houses. They lost their jobs through no fault of their own. They're getting kicked out, either as a renter or as a mortgager. The HEROES Act deals with that. Money to help our small businesses, and not just a few, but the restaurants and the stages and venues, the broadcasters and newspapers and nonprofits and rural hospitals, all left out in the Republican proposal, are in the HEROES bill. Money for unemployment. The $600 pandemic unemployment kept 10 million people out of poverty and pumps money into the economy, as well as giving people who are not wealthy at all an ability to get by. That's in the HEROES bill. And there is so much more. Money to make sure our elections are guarded and safe. Provisions that allow the census to be counted in a fair way. All of that is in the HEROES bill. The American people so much want us to pass it. But Leader McConnell will not even put it on the floor for a debate. If Leader McConnell and his Republican majority have an ounce of concern for average American families, they would halt this sham Supreme Court process and join us in taking up the critical pieces of legislation which my colleagues and I will be putting on the floor all afternoon. In each case, we're not asking the Congress to pass it, the Senate to pass it. We're simply asking them to debate it. We're asking them to overrule Leader McConnell and put these bills on the floor and let there be a debate and let there be amendments. That's all we ask during the most desperate of times. All we ask is the ability to debate something that really matters to the American people, instead of rushing through a judge, Supreme Court nominee, when the American people want the decision made by them, not by Republican senators, not when her views only represent an extreme minority of the American people, her views on the key issues. So, Mr. President, in order to proceed to the consideration of H.R. 25, the HEROES 2 bill, I ask unanimous consent. Nope. Wrong number. Sorry. No. What did I say? Oh, pardon me. Let me repeat that. In order to proceed to the consideration of H.R. 925, HEROES 2, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session.
Mr. President,
The majority whip.
reserving the right to object, the minority leader is requesting to move to legislation after having repeatedly this week requested and asked for votes to adjourn multiple times, leave town. Now all of a sudden, he wants to legislate. I think there's a serious question about the sincerity of the minority leader's request here, Mr. President. And frankly, to his point, the United States Senate has now twice, and most recently this week, on Tuesday this week, voted on legislation that would do all the things that he says that he wants to do. Help people who are unemployed. We voted on a bill that had unemployment insurance for people who are unemployed. Help small businesses. We have a bipartisan agreement on the Paycheck Protection Program to provide assistance to small businesses, and that was blocked by the Democrats earlier this week. It had money in there, resources on a bipartisan, agreed-upon objective, and that is more money, more resources for schools and universities to open safely. $100 billion in there for schools to open safely. They blocked it. They objected. It had money in there for farmers, something that's important to the presiding officer and to me as well. They blocked it. It had money in there for the Postal Service, something that his side has been saying repeatedly we need to address. They blocked it. We had that vote this week. We've taken up legislation exactly along the lines of what the Democrat leader is asking for, and they have consistently blocked it. So, and then to say, well, let's adjourn. We've had multiple votes on adjourning. This isn't serious, and he knows it. This is all about politics. This is a bogus issue to detract the Senate from the work at hand, which is to confirm a well-qualified judge to the Supreme Court, who had a well-qualified recommendation from the American Bar Association, which the Democrat leader in the past has said is the gold standard when it comes to processing and considering judicial nominations. So, Mr. President, let's see this for what it is, call it out for what it is. And the bill he's calling up, by the way, from the House of Representatives, if you look at all the stuff it had in it, and this is the all-or-nothing approach that they're advocating right now, tax cuts for Manhattan millionaires. They're always complaining about tax cuts for the rich. This is tax cuts for millionaires in New York and California. Blue state bailouts for his state of New York. Think about that. Is that really what the American people think we ought to be voting on right now when they're unemployed, small businesses need help? And that's the other thing, the bill he's trying to call up right now, has no assistance in there for the PPP program. The very program that everybody around the country has said has provided enormous assistance to small businesses, kept them in business. And there are other businesses who need that help. He talked about wanting to help businesses that are going out of business. Well, that bill that he's trying to call up right now doesn't include assistance for small businesses. So anyway, Mr. President, this is clearly an attempt to detract the Senate from the work at hand, which is to consider a very well-qualified nominee to the United States Supreme Court, one of the Senate's most important constitutional duties and responsibilities. And we intend to stay focused on that. And if the leader is genuinely interested, he could let us get on the bill that we tried to call up earlier this week that deals with all the coronavirus relief issues that he mentioned earlier, all of which are bipartisan issues, every single one of them on that list. But that isn't what this is about. This is about politics. So, Mr. President, I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. The Democrat leader.
Just a few quick points. Number one, we are not talking about, and the American people are not about qualifications. We are talking about views on issues. Do the American people want their health care taken away from them? Amy Coney Barrett has said that she disagrees with the decision to keep it. Do the American people, do American women want the right to choose taken away from them? Amy Coney Barrett in the past has said she would do that. Do the American people want to make it even harder to form a union so they might get some good pay? Amy Coney Barrett. How about gun safety? She's to the right of Scalia. The issue on Amy Coney Barrett is twofold, and nothing they say changes it. Number one, her views on the issues are so far and so extreme that she does not represent even the views of the people in this body on the Senate side. And number two, if they feel that the American people want her, let them vote and decide. The very same thing my friend from South Dakota and everyone else said with Merrick Garland. We know hypocrisy when we see it. We know contradictions when we see them. And on the bill, yeah, let's debate it. But their bill is inadequate on testing, inadequate on small business, inadequate on schools. We went to school administrators. No money for state and local governments. And I dare say to my friend from South Dakota, a police officer, a firefighter, someone who picks up the garbage or drives the buses, needs help in South Dakota if it's a red state, or New York if it's a blue state. It's despicable when the bill goes for all states to say it's just for blue states. That's the kind of divisiveness that Donald Trump has created in this country. It's why so many people don't like him, and what our Republican colleagues, unfortunately, since he's become president, have followed through on. Our bill is far more comprehensive. It deals with the needs. Very little money for testing, very little money for state and local governments. no money to help restaurants or stages or nonprofits or rural hospitals. No money for hospitals in general. So the bottom line is very simple. Ours is a broad, comprehensive bill. Theirs is a narrow, skinny bill done to appease 20 Republican senators who wanted no money. No money. And they won't even debate that either. So I say to my good friend from South Dakota, and he is my friend, we have one view. The American people are for a $2 trillion bill. A recent poll showed 60, 70%. They have a much narrower view based on a hard right philosophy. Bring this bill to the floor and let's debate it. It passed the House. It's the only thing that has a chance of getting done. And if you want to make amendments to cut back on the money and help we need, we welcome that debate. But don't just block something that has a real chance of becoming law, as opposed to the farcical exercise they engaged in on Tuesday in a totally partisan bill that got not a single Democratic vote. Let's have a debate. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Republican whip.
Mr. President, if I could just make one quick observation here. First off, the funding that was provided in the Republican bill wasn't inconsequential. It was $650 billion. And to the Democratic leader's point about the people in this country want which is now a $2.4 trillion bill, boy, I tell you, I haven't seen that anywhere. And maybe there's some polling out there that indicates that, but I think if you ask the question, would you want to spend $2.4 trillion if you knew you were borrowing it from your children and grandchildren, you might get a different answer. And the truth of the matter is, we've done $3.5 trillion, all borrowed money, all added to the debt already to address coronavirus relief. That being said, we did bring a bill up that was another $650 billion, and the Democrats blocked it. Why? Because it didn't spend enough, and they didn't think it spent enough on the things that they thought it ought to spend money on. Well, if that's the debate, let's get on our bill. Let's start at the $650 billion base level, and they can offer amendments to increase funding. And by the way, we did have funding in there for testing and vaccines, significant amounts of money negotiated by Lamar Alexander, the chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. But if that's what they want to do, then let's start there, and then they can have an opportunity to debate it and offer amendments. But they blocked even getting on the bill. Not the bill itself, even debating it. So when he says we want to have a debate, we could have had a debate. All they had to do was let us get on the bill, and then we could be offering up and debating and discussing these various amendments that they want to offer. But I would argue that all the things that our bill includes are things that are important to the American people. It was a targeted bill. It was a fiscally responsible bill. And yes, it got 52 out of 53 Republicans to vote for it, not a single Democrat. Why? Because the Democrats have an all-or-nothing approach, and they want to hold this process hostage to get a left-wing agenda of items included in the legislation, many of which have no relationship whatsoever to coronavirus. So the leader's point, and by the way, with respect to the judge, yes, Judge Barrett is, I think, everything that the American people want to see in a Supreme Court justice. And for him to get up here and say that she doesn't have views that are supported by the American people, I don't understand exactly that argument, because my understanding of what a judge is supposed to do is to take the facts of a case, apply the law, apply the Constitution in an impartial way, and apply those as written, not to try and get some perceived outcome or result or policy preference. That's not what judges do. What you heard him say is exactly why we have a difference of opinion about the judiciary in this country, because they view the judiciary as an auxiliary legislature where you go to get outcomes and results that you can't get through the two political branches of our government. Well, that's not what the judiciary is. The judiciary is supposed to be independent. It is supposed to be a fair arbiter, looks at it calls balls and strikes and doesn't try and step on the scales or write the rules of the game. That's what a judge is supposed to be. So they don't like this justice, or this judge, I should say, hopefully soon to be justice, because they think She's going to rule a certain way on particular cases, and they have no idea about that. I mean, think about it. The same argument's been made against Republican nominees to the Supreme Court literally for the last 30 or 40 years. Every single time a Republican president nominates an individual to the Supreme Court, the Democrats and the left get up and say they're going to cut health care. They're going to destroy health care. They were saying that about justices on the Supreme Court that vote with their wing more than anybody else. They said that about Chief Justice Roberts. He was going to kill health care. He was going to destroy health care for millions of Americans. He cast the deciding vote to uphold the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. So they don't know what a judge is going to do, but I know what she's going to do because she's proven it. As a judge on the appellate circuit, the Seventh Circuit, as an academic, in her writings, that she believes the role of a judge is to take the facts of a case, apply the law, apply the Constitution as written impartially, and to render a decision. That, to me, is what I think every American believes we ought to have in a Supreme Court justice. So, yeah, this may be, you know, it's fair game for them to come down here and offer up all these motions that we're going to hear repetitively today, none of which have anything to do with the issue that they're going to say they want to talk about, but everything to do with the fact that we are considering an incredibly well qualified, not by my opinion, but by everybody who's ever worked with her, including the dean of the Notre Dame Law School who hired her, the ABA, the American Bar Association, which passes judgment on all these nominees, her colleagues on the Seventh Circuit, staff, everybody this person's ever interacted with. Stellar recommendations. This is an incredibly qualified individual, and somebody, by the way, who I think can be relatable to the American people because she deals with the same issues that all Americans do, trying to raise 7 kids. Imagine that. Imagine trying to organize your schedule around 7 kids. Continue to be a professional. Do exceptional work. Highly qualified. Towering intellect, she's been described by her colleagues. So, Mr. President, that's what this is about. It's about trying to block a well-qualified judge to the Supreme Court simply because they don't like the process, and I understand that, but this is a constitutional process. This is a vacancy. The Constitution doesn't follow the political calendar when it comes to filling vacancies. And as you heard Leader McConnell point out earlier today, precedent on this issue, on confirming a nominee by a president to a vacancy created in an election year, the precedent falls all one way if you go back throughout history. So this is about, so just so people know, every time they get up and offer a unanimous consent request to call up a piece of legislation, it has nothing to do with the legislation because they've already moved to adjourn multiple times this week, meaning they want to get out of town. They don't want anything to do with this, with the Supreme Court. So these are all, they're going to get up and say Republicans are blocking this or that. And as I pointed out, the first one that was offered was a bill to deal with the coronavirus and provide relief to people across this country, which, by the way, we just voted on 3 days ago, here in the United States Senate. They blocked even getting on the bill, not considering the substance of it, which, by the way, as I said, includes a lot of bipartisan objectives and priorities. They blocked even considering it. So that's what this is about, and I expect that's what we're going to hear today, tomorrow, and the next day. But it's not going to deter us from the important work that we have at hand. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Democrat whip.
Mr. President, I listened carefully when the senator from Kentucky came forward, his statement on the floor this morning. It was a lengthy defense of the procedure that's being followed in terms of the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. It's not the first time he's made this historic defense, and clearly he is going to continue. He obviously feels that he's on the defense when it comes to explaining it. I think he is. I think everyone remembers Merrick Garland, the pronouncement by Senator McConnell and all of the Republican senators that Barack Obama did not have the authority in the last year in office to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court. When he sent the name Merrick Garland to the Hill, Senator McConnell let the word go out that he would not even meet with the man in his office. He would not show him the respect of meeting with him. 2 or 3 Republican senators broke with that command from Senator McConnell, but most went right along. It was a very low moment. It's one that we haven't forgotten, and I don't believe the American people have forgotten, because we've rewritten the rules. And now when it comes to a Republican president, Senator McConnell says, why, of course he can fill the vacancy. He can even fill it while votes are being cast in his reelection campaign. It's an enormous departure from 4 years ago. And Senator McConnell comes to the floor regularly to try to explain it away, and it just doesn't work. He'll keep trying. He has no alternative. But if most Americans tuned in to this hearing, this session this morning and afternoon, I'm not sure that they would dwell on the rules of the Senate or the rules of the Senate Judiciary Committee. They would probably be asking themselves and the members of their family a very basic question. What's wrong with the Senate? Doesn't the United States Senate know what's going on across America? This morning's New York Times front page. New peak for U.S. cases, over 82,000 in a single day. 13 states endure their worst week yet. Warnings of a cold weather surge. The article, of course referring to COVID-19, says, the United States is in the midst of one of the most severe surges of the coronavirus to date, with more new cases reported across the country on Friday than on any other single day since the pandemic began. We sit here arguing about the rules of the committee and the rules of the Senate and who came first and who shot who. The American people would like us to focus on something that has real relevance to their life. Listen to some of the things that are reported this morning in this newspaper about what's going on across America when it comes to this coronavirus. On Thursday, the same day that President Trump said the coronavirus was, quote, going away, close quote, and Joseph Biden warned of a, quote, dark winter ahead, close quote, the United States recorded one of its highest daily totals of new cases, 75,064. By Friday evening, a new peak in the pandemic had been reached when more than 82,000 cases in a single day were reported nationwide, breaking the daily record set on July 16th by more than 3,000 cases. 13 states have had more new infections in the past week than in any other 7-day stretch. Hotspots are emerging across the country. Officials in Kentucky announced more than 1,470 cases on Thursday, the biggest one-day jump in that state. More than 1,300 cases reported in Colorado, another single-day record. And in the state of Washington, Governor Jay Inslee tweeted that the state had passed the 100,000 case mark, adding that, quote, we all need to commit to having fewer, shorter, safer interactions, especially as the weather keeps us inside more often. Mr. President, that is what's happening in America. It's not what's happening on the floor of the Senate. We're embroiled in a political controversy over a Supreme Court nominee instead of focusing on the deadly situation that's going on across our nation. I've spoken to Governor Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, regularly about his battle to try to find equipment and treatment for the people in our state. It's a lonely, unpopular battle that he fights. This governor in Illinois, as governors across the nation, have to stand up, if they are responsible, have to stand up and say to the people, the residents of their state, some things that they don't want to hear. I don't like wearing these masks. Most people don't. But it's a simple, effective way to dramatically increase the spread of this virus. I don't like the notion of social distancing. I certainly don't like the idea of being away from my grandkids and the rest of my family. But if it means keeping them alive, I'm going to do it, as painful as it may be. These are the simple, basic things that we are now debating from one end of America to the other. This coronavirus situation has reached such a terrible state that yesterday, when the Director of Public Health for the state of Illinois gave her daily briefing, Dr. Ezike is her name, She's a wonderful African-American doctor who has just been steadfast through this whole battle against the pandemic. In the middle of her presentation about what was facing our state, she broke down crying. I would have too. She turned her back for a moment, tried to compose herself, and could barely finish her press conference. She begged the people of my state of Illinois, please, if for no other reason, for the sake of the healthcare professionals who risk their lives to treat these people, please help us put an end to this virus. Last Saturday, Mr. President, a week ago today, one of my dear friends for years and years was feeling sick, called her daughter and said, I think I need to go to the hospital. Her daughter took her to the major hospital not far from their home for admission because of lung problems. The hospital would not accept her. All the rooms were full. She then went to the second largest hospital in the area, asking if she could be admitted and treated. They would not accept her. All the rooms were full. She finally made it into the third hospital. She survived until Tuesday morning when she passed away. In the United States of America, that someone who had health insurance, was prepared to pay, could not even be admitted to major hospitals because of this coronavirus pandemic. And we are sitting here on the floor arguing about who was appointed by which president 100 years ago. Do you wonder why people look at the Senate and say, you're irrelevant? You're not even addressing the issues we care about. And the procedural play here means nothing. Oh, I've offered an amendment, you voted no. And the people at the bottom line say, grow up and do something to help America. We know what it takes to reach an agreement, as we found on March 26, when we passed the CARES Act. Passed it in the Senate with a vote of 96-0, a bipartisan, strong vote, not a single dissenting vote. $3.3 trillion to address this pandemic in our economy. We rose to the occasion, and I went home and people were amazed. Do you mean you actually did something in the Senate? Yes, we did. How did we reach that point? It wasn't through the regular order. It was through honest, serious negotiation that took place between the White House and the leaders in Congress. But since then, we've not seen that. There has been one group that has stayed away from all of the negotiations around a table. The White House is there, Secretary Mnuchin is there, Speaker Pelosi is there, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader of the Senate, is there. The Republicans have refused to sit down and negotiate at the table. That's how it gets done around here. People sit down and work out their differences and put a bill on the floor and pass it 96-0. But Senator McConnell has steadfastly refused to attend these negotiating sessions. Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader, joins him. So they boycott the sessions and come to the floor with a take it or leave it partisan amendment in order to cover some political concerns back home. What a shame. What a waste. And when Senator McConnell announced just a few days ago to the White House, stop negotiating, there'll be no bill before the election, there'll be no COVID relief before the election, people back in Illinois said to me, what is he thinking? Doesn't he understand the reality of what's going on in states like Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan and across the nation? The infection rate, the death rate, hospitals being pushed to the limit? Nope. Clearly, that's not a priority for Senator McConnell and the Senate Republicans. The priority is not the millions who are at risk. The priority is not the hundreds who are dying. The priority is one Supreme Court nominee. And so we are bound to spend 5 straight days on that issue and not a minute of that time dealing with COVID-19. How do you explain that to the American people? I don't believe you can. I could go through the lengthy history, I'll put it in the record, about this Barrett nomination. But I'll just tell you that when it comes right down to it, we cannot explain how we are going to leave here Monday night voting on one nominee, but empty-handed when it comes to COVID-19. There is no excuse for that. And that's where we find ourselves. I want to tell a story of why the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett directly links up with my concern about this pandemic. Having lost 220,000 American lives, My concern and the concern of everyone is to keep our families safe. And the first question which we ask one another is, you do have health insurance, don't you? It's the obvious question. I remember a time in my own life, newly married, law student, my wife and I blessed with a little girl who came pretty quickly, and she was pretty sick. And we had no health insurance. No health insurance. She was treated by local hospitals here in Washington where I was going to law school. And they called me in one day and said, well, since you don't have any health insurance, you have three options. You can declare bankruptcy with all these medical bills. And I said, doesn't sound right to me. I haven't even taken the bankruptcy course in law school. Well, what else? Well, you can file, we think you qualify for welfare, Medicaid. That doesn't sound right either. I'm training to be a lawyer. I'm supposed to end up with a good paying job at some point in my life. Going on welfare in law school? What else is the option? Well, the only other option is we'll total up all your bills and you can pay them back to us over a period of years. It took us 10 years. 10 years to pay those bills because I had no health insurance. Did I remember that moment? I remembered it for the rest of my life. To be a father and a husband without health insurance and a sick baby, thinking, my goodness, is this going to keep the good doctors away? Will she get the treatment she needs to survive? That's what we're up against now. Because the Affordable Care Act, which I voted for 10 years ago on this floor, extended health insurance to 23 million Americans, 600,000 in the state of Illinois. And it changed health insurance for everybody. Because now the health insurance companies lost some of their tricks of the trade. They can no longer put a lifetime limit on how much they pay out. They can no longer discriminate against a person because it happens to be a woman. They can no longer discriminate based on pre-existing conditions. They've got to provide family health insurance, the option of keeping kids on the policy till they reach the age of 26. That affects all policies. So what has been the approach of the Republicans, particularly this president? He wants to eliminate that. What I've just described, he wants to eliminate. Don't take my word for it. It's been filed in a case across the street, Texas versus California. A group of Republican attorneys general came forward and said, we want to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. And the president said, I'm going to join you. Let's get rid of it. They had tried on the Senate floor in 2017. It's one of those moments etched in my memory, sitting down there at my desk, and I looked at that door over there, and it opened at 1:30 a.m., and John McCain, Republican senator from Arizona, walked through that door, stood in the well, and could barely lift that right arm that had been shattered when he was a prisoner of war, lifted it just enough to say no. That no saved the Affordable Care Act from being eliminated by the Senate. And so where do they turn if they can't get it done in Congress? Off to the courts. And why is that important in terms of this nomination of Amy Coney Barrett? Because they're bound and determined to fill that vacancy on the court before November 10th. Why November 10th? Because that's the day the court takes up the oral arguments on the future of the Affordable Care Act. And if she is not in her black robe listening to that argument, by tradition, she can't vote on whether to eliminate it or not. She sent plenty of signals in the past about what she feels about the Affordable Care Act. And my friend from South Dakota who says, you don't know how she's going to rule, there's some truth to that. She could change her mind. But I'll tell you, if you were a betting person, you'd say the statements that she made criticizing Chief Justice Roberts for saving the Affordable Care Act, other statements that she's made about the law itself suggest she will not be a friend when she has an opportunity to vote. Do we take that seriously? On behalf of 600,000 people in Illinois, you bet I do. It directly relates to this pandemic and the opportunity for people across this country to have the coverage they need. I'm going to tell a quick story about one of them. I have a photo of her here, and I want to share with people the situation that she faces. Sorry that I don't have that in front of me, but I'm going to tell the story anyway because I remember it. Her last name is Dannenberger. She's from New Berlin, Illinois. Amazing young woman. She's battling breast cancer. because, here it is, thank you. When we cut corners when it comes to the Affordable Care Act, Susan Dannenberger is one of the victims. She's a fifth-generation farmer and winemaker. She's got a great little vineyard and a great little restaurant, and I've been out there with my family. She's also a two-time cancer fighter with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. She's been through the gauntlet of medical procedures, treatments, and complications in recent years. A double mastectomy, radiation, IV, chemo, pulmonary embolisms, lung infections, and more. Her oral chemo medications alone have cost her thousands of dollars every single month, even with insurance. As a business owner, Susan offers insurance to her employees. She was relieved to learn when opening her new health policy that the ACA guarantees that she gets coverage, even with that medical history. It also allows her 23-year-old son to stay on the family plan. Here's what she says to me. Most of the times I feel driven. Making wine, running a winery is more than just a job. It's my purpose. I'm more scared than I pretend to be, and that is how I make it through. I pretend that everything's okay. But this year, it's harder to pretend that everything's going to be okay. I'm worried about the future. I'm worried about money. I'm worried that I won't be able to afford to fight cancer. I'm worried about taxes, health insurance changes, and being at the mercy of insurance companies. For Americans like Susan, with a family, a business, pre-existing conditions, there's so much at stake with this case pending before the Supreme Court and the judges and justices who will vote on it. Susan, bless you, she just can't afford for this court to strike down the Affordable Care Act. Where will she turn? Oh, you must conclude. Durbin, you're not telling the whole story. Tell us about the Republican alternative to the Affordable Care Act. Tell us about their substitute, the one that's going to save everybody so much money and provide all the same coverage. Tell us about that. Well, I sure would like to, but I can't because it's never been written down on paper ever. There is no Republican alternative. They are bound and determined to kill Obamacare with no substitute. That's why John McCain voted no. He said we owe it to the American people to give them an alternative. Sadly, unfortunately, there's still no alternative. Mr. President, Senator Schumer earlier in the day noted that there are a lot of other things we should be taking up at this moment in time. I'm going to mention a few here this morning. These are measures which passed the House of Representatives sometimes months ago, sometimes over a year ago, sent to the desk of Senator McConnell. They were never taken up. They've been sitting there while we've done little or nothing on the floor of the Senate except entertain his judicial nominations. The first one's personal to me, not that it affects me personally, legally, but it's relating to a bill that I introduced a long time ago. On June 4th, 2019, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 6, the Dream and Promise Act, strong bipartisan vote, giving a path to citizenship to dreamers. Mr. President, I introduced the first DREAM Act 19 years ago. I've been working on this ever since. These are young immigrants brought to the United States as toddlers, infants, and children. The Dream and Promise Act has now been sitting on Senator McConnell's desk for more than a year. More than a year. On June 22nd, I sent a letter signed by all the Democratic senators calling on Senator McConnell to finally bring it up for a vote. 4 months later, Senator McConnell has not even responded. We sent our letter after the Supreme Court rejected President Trump's effort to end deportation for dreamers. In the opinion by Chief Justice Roberts, here's what he said about the actions of the Trump administration on DACA. Here's what he said: arbitrary and capricious. That was the description. I joined with Senator Dick Lugar, a Republican, years ago, asking for the president to create DACA. President Obama responded with creating it by executive order. Sadly, President Trump eliminated it. And literally hundreds of thousands of young people have their fate in doubt because of it. The same thing is true when it comes to temporary protected status for people in the United States. This administration has been a scourge when it comes to the issue of immigration, particularly inspired by Stephen Miller, a person I could never, ever understand. they've decided to be as mean as possible and cruel when it comes to people who are in this country having left horrible circumstances at home. Now's the time for us to take up this measure, to start the debate. It isn't as if we have so much else to do. What we should be doing is to make sure that we do this. And so, Mr. President, in order to proceed with consideration of H.R. 6, the American Dream and Promise Act, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Indiana.
reserving the right to object. You know, I've only been here a little under 2 years, and in the time that I've been here, it's been disappointing that when it comes to real attempts to make legislative progress, so often I see that we are far apart in terms of how we want to go about it. I came here from a state like Indiana, where serving in our state legislature, running a business for 37 years, we seem to get things done. Even though we were divided, of course, like most legislative bodies are, we came together and did things that made a difference for our constituents. In the time before the impeachment saga came along, COVID, civil unrest, I thought many of us were putting our shoulders to the grindstone, and I'm on committees like Health, Education, Labor, and Pension. Wanted to weigh in on talking about some of the things the Democrats have brought up about health care. And to me, again, I think it brings in front of us differences in approach, certainly. I'm a believer that rather than trying to get government even more involved in certain things, that we might look at what actually works in the real world, works in many states, including health care, which I agree is probably the #1 issue we face as a country. It was a #1 issue when I was running a business. And I think there's so much commonality in the sense that we've got a broken health care system. We sometimes, as conservatives, are slow to maneuver, may not be interested in doing things that need to be done, but I think there's a time and a place for that. And I was pleased to see, I think, 70, 80 senators weighed in on trying to fix health care. But what interrupted that progress was several months of an impeachment saga that proved to go nowhere. Then we've been confronted with the biggest health crisis, certainly in a century. Other issues. But in this case, I think, to me, trying to cut to the chase, this is clearly a sequence of maneuvers that is trying to interject in a process of getting one of the most qualified judges across the finish line to become a Supreme Court justice. And I think the American people are watching, too. They see what goes on here. They see that year after year, we seem not to deliver results. And when it comes to stuff that should be simple, when it's clear based upon the credentials, especially of someone like Amy Coney Barrett, who comes from my state, that has done such an outstanding job as an appellate judge, impeccable credentials, and to where now this is being litigated not on the merits of who she is and how she will handle herself as a Supreme Court justice. It's gotten so partisan. I think that really does turn people off. I think this is more a sequence of maybe we're both guilty of, to where we do not roll up our sleeves, get to the heart of the matter. I was happy to be the first Republican to come across and acknowledge that climate is an issue. Formed the Climate Caucus, got 6 other Republicans to do it. I think we've got to be engaged in the key issues of the day. And again, as I said earlier, we sometimes are slow to come to the discussion. But in the time that I'm going to spend here, I would hope that we do legislation in the time that is there to do it and not try to interject it into a process like this. I'm so happy that we've got this in a situation where we're going to get her voted in on Monday. And in the meantime, I think that any of the attempts that are made by the other side to belabor the point just shows the American public of what's wrong with this institution. So, that being said, I do think that she's a qualified nominee to the Supreme Court. That's of the utmost importance that we do not belabor the process, and I object to proceeding to legislative session.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I would say to the senator from Indiana, I recognize that he is new to this body, and what he has seen in the Senate is not the Senate that I was elected to. There was a time, the senator may find it hard to believe, that we actually brought bills to the floor. We allowed amendments. And before that, of course, the committee had done its work. We allowed amendments on the floor up or down, and we ended up deliberating and voting. And measures, if they passed here, would then head to conference and miraculously at some point become law. That has not happened here for a long, long time. And I don't think you've seen it. Maybe the defense authorization bill is as close as it gets, though we don't have active amendments there. In this circumstance, on this bill, which I brought before the Senate Judiciary Committee 18 years ago, it has passed the House of Representatives and sitting on Senator McConnell's desk for a year. It has been referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I co-chair the Immigration Subcommittee with your colleague who's standing to your right from Texas. We have met twice in the last 2 years, twice, and never taken this up. So for the sake of the people affected by it, asking that it come to the floor is not an unreasonable request. Their lives are tied up in it. So I would love to see the regular order. We haven't seen it in so long, most people wouldn't recognize it. But I understand your objection. I have a series, but I'm only going to make one more unanimous consent request because I see members waiting to speak. This one is very relevant, very timely. Mr. President, we know that foreign election interference continues to be a real threat in America. Just this week, we learned a foreign influence campaign carried out by Iran in which fake menacing emails were sent to Democratic voters who were told to vote for Trump or, quote, "will come after you," close quote. Origin, we're told by our intelligence agencies, Iran. FBI Director Wray has said that Russia has been, quote, "very active in its efforts to influence the election and seeks to, quote, denigrate Democratic nominee Joe Biden." Two countries up to their elbows in trying to make a mess of our election campaign. It's well past time to address this threat. We spend a lot of time talking about it. We could do it today by passing a House-passed SHIELD Act. This is a bill passed in the House of Representatives that would establish a duty to report election interference from foreign entities, so the FBI and the Federal Election Commission are aware when foreign powers are offering unlawful election assistance to campaigns and other political committees. This bill would restrict the exchange of campaign information with foreign entities by making it illegal to offer non-public campaign material to foreign governments and those linked with foreign governments. The bill would improve transparency by applying existing campaign advertising requirements to online advertisements, and it would close critical loopholes in the law to further limit political spending by foreign nationals and foreign governments to try to influence the outcome of a U.S. election. Finally, the bill would prohibit deceptive practices about voting procedures to stop individuals from providing false information about voting rules and qualifications for voting. In light of these ongoing threats to both presidential candidates, President Trump as well as Vice President Biden, this is a bipartisan attack. They're not just going after Democrats or Republicans, they're going after all of us. Isn't it about time we said we're fed up with it and it's got to stop? That's all this bill does. It's bipartisan. In order to proceed to the consideration of this bill in time for it to affect the outcome of this election, perhaps, H.R. 4617, SHIELD Act, I ask we proceed to consideration of it to prevent foreign interference in elections. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Indiana.
reserving the right to object, as I said earlier, the Senate is currently considering the nomination of a highly qualified nominee to be an associate to the Supreme Court. This request is another procedural move to just belabor the process. They voted to adjourn until after the election 4 times this week. So obviously this bill, even though it may have merits that we need to discuss, should not be done in this format. Continuing to consider this highly qualified nominee to the Supreme Court is the most important thing that we should do here. Therefore, I object to proceeding to legislative session.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I'm going to put my statements in the record here as to the other 3 bills and make a general UC request as to all of them and on bank, as they say. In order to proceed to consideration of H.R. 4995, Maternal Health Quality Improvement Act of 2020, H.R. 4996, Helping Moms Act of 2020, and H.R. 1585, Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to a legislative session.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Indiana.
I object to proceeding to everything en bloc.
Objection is heard.
Yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, on Thursday, the Senate Judiciary Committee advanced the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett unanimously. It was unanimous because our Democratic colleagues sought to boycott the meeting, but what they basically did is expedite consideration of her nomination. It was really kind of puzzling to see the chairs that were set aside for our Democratic colleagues filled with large blown up pictures. And I'll sort of get to that in a moment. The false narrative that we've seen here, because our colleagues cannot successfully attack the character or the qualifications of this incredible nominee to this seat on the Supreme Court. She discussed, Judge Barrett discussed everything from the separation of powers to the free expression clause of the First Amendment. And many of us marveled at her knowledge and her ability to recall facts and legal decisions without so much as even a note in front of her. It's no surprise that the American Bar Association, which the minority leader has called the gold standard, gave her their highest rating. The chair of the Standing Committee on the Judiciary said in interviews with individuals in the legal profession and community who know Judge Barrett, whether for a few years or decades, not one person uttered a negative word about her character. That assessment's in line with the glowing letters of support we've seen from her former colleagues and students whose political philosophies and beliefs fall across the entire political spectrum. What we've repeatedly heard is about Judge Barrett's brilliance, her strong character, her great temperament, and her impressive humility. Judge Barrett, I'm convinced, will serve our nation well on the Supreme Court. It's clear that the mountains of evidence stand in sharp contrast to the portrait that our colleagues across the aisle have attempted to paint of this nominee. Democrats have tried to claim that she is somehow too radical, despite the fact that in her 3 years on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, she has agreed with her colleagues 95% of the time in 600 cases they've decided. Back in 2017, when she was nominated to the Seventh Circuit, she was attacked explicitly because of her Catholic faith, even though our colleagues know that under the Constitution, no religious test is permissible, and really suggesting that because of her faith, she couldn't follow her oath to decide cases on the facts and the law that come before her. Truly insulting and completely out of character with the person that we saw in Judge Barrett in front of the Judiciary Committee. Our colleagues even went so far as to hold up a chart with more than 100 cases listed and claimed that Judge Barrett would overturn every single one of those precedents. Well, there's certainly no evidence of that, nothing in her record that would suggest it. With her fidelity to the law, would you think she would be so reckless? Well, of course not. There's just no evidence to support it. But we know that because they couldn't attack her on the merits, they decided to use fear-mongering instead. Through innuendo, misinformation, and intellectually dishonest arguments, they've been trying to stoke fears about how she may rule on a case which she has not even heard yet. This is sort of a sky is falling argument, a Chicken Little argument. But it really has to do more with the way our Democratic colleagues view the judicial branch. They view it as another political branch as opposed to an apolitical branch that's supposed to interpret the law and the facts and decide cases on their own merits. Instead of addressing her judicial philosophy, our Democratic colleagues eagerly shared their plan, should she be confirmed, to pack the Supreme Court with additional justices to give them the political results that they cannot achieve with the current composition of the court. This is something that Ruth Bader Ginsburg explicitly condemned, saying this would turn the Supreme Court into just another political body. Because you can imagine, if Democrats, when they're in power, decide to add additional judges who may decide cases in a way they would like to see them decided, the temptation would be great for the other side of the aisle to add judges to the Supreme Court. And it would completely destroy what has been rightly called the crown jewels of our Constitution, and that is our independent judiciary. Well, for many Americans, the idea of mutating our only apolitical branch of government is absolutely terrifying. So, not surprisingly, our colleagues across the aisle have tried to rebrand and call this rebalancing the court. Well, this is what we would call back home putting lipstick on a pig. Using words like rebalance is a way to obscure really what their goal is. They want to seize what they view as an unaccountable body and to use it to secure wins they can't win in the rough and tumble of the legislative process. If you can't win an election, if you can't win a vote in Congress, well, get the Supreme Court, get the judiciary to bail you out. That's not the appropriate role of judges or the judiciary under our Constitution. Our Democratic colleagues seem absolutely fearful about judges who will actually apply the law as written. They want somebody to impose a result that they wish was required. They want judges who evaluate cases not by the letter of the law, but through the same lens of personal and political biases. In short, they don't really want a fair and impartial judge like Judge Barrett. They want a guaranteed result. Our Democratic colleagues repeatedly pushed Judge Barrett to say how she would rule on future cases. They asked her to share her personal views on controversial issues. They demanded a commitment from her to recuse herself from specific cases. But once again, Judge Barrett proved why she's the right person for this job. She followed the precedent set by former and current justices and respectfully refrained from answering those sort of provocative questions. Contrary to what our Democratic colleagues believe, Supreme Court justices are not life-tenured super legislators. They're obligated to apply the law as written. No favors, no biases, no predetermined outcomes. That's what Judge Ginsburg said when she was confirmed. And that's why it's so important to confirm Amy Coney Barrett. She's artfully demonstrated her understanding of the rule of the judiciary and has shown she has the temperament and the intellect and the experience to serve on the nation's highest court. She won't impose her personal belief. She said that time and time again. And to suggest that she somehow would violate her judicial oath in a future case is inconsistent with everything we have come to know about Amy Coney Barrett. She won't impose her personal belief. She won't try to favor one side over the other, and she won't legislate from the bench. That's exactly the kind of nominee that Republicans and Democrats should want on the high court. So I look forward to supporting Judge Barrett's nomination on Monday when we finally vote to confirm her. And briefly on another matter, Mr. President, on Thursday's presidential debate, former Vice President Joe Biden said he wants to transition the U.S. from the oil industry. Actually, Governor Abbott appropriately said, no, Joe Biden really wants to transition hundreds of thousands of Texans from their paycheck. What Joe Biden is sending is a not too subtly coded message that he wants to end our energy industry as we know it. This is an industry that, according to one study, directly or indirectly supports 1 out of every 6 jobs in my state and is a pillar of our state's economy. Through tax revenue, high-paying jobs, and downstream economic gains, communities across Texas reap substantial benefits from our thriving oil and gas industry every day. And those benefits reach beyond our borders or the borders of any other energy-producing state. That's because of the hard-working men and women on rigs in the fields and refineries. Because of their work, the American people have access to reliable and affordable energy. In places like California and New York, folks can't turn on their lights, fill up their gas tanks, or hop on an airplane without ever thinking about the men and women who made that seemingly simple task possible. And now we're seeing our Democratic colleagues fighting to leave these energy sources in the dust. They're talking about switching to renewables, as if it were simple as turning on a light switch. In Texas, we literally believe in an all-of-the-above energy policy. We produce more electricity from wind energy, from wind turbines than any other state in the nation. But we know what the reality of the kind of transition that Vice President Biden has talked about would mean. We got a taste of how disastrous it would be earlier this year. When the coronavirus pandemic hit, the need for Texas's greatest natural resource plummeted. With fewer cars on the roads and fewer planes in the sky, oil and gas producers were left with a lot of supply and not much demand. And that's when the layoffs began. A new report by Deloitte found that between March and August of this year, about 107,000 energy workers in Texas were laid off. And that doesn't include the countless workers who had their pay cut or who were temporarily furloughed. To make matters worse, this study found that as much as 70% of those jobs might not even come back by the end of 2021. And that's if we continue business as usual. If the Vice President's plan to destroy our energy industry were enacted, these workers would have no jobs to come back to. And it would be only the beginning of the cascading negative economic consequences. Many Americans aren't old enough to remember the 1970s energy crisis, which put our energy dependence in this country in the spotlight. The situation was so bad that gas stations were serving customers by appointment only. Some states banned neon signs to cut down on energy use, and a number of towns asked their citizens not to even put up Christmas lights. It was a hard, cold dose of reality that brought America's energy dependence to light and underscored the need to increase our domestic resources and wean ourselves off of the dependency on foreign oil. And that's exactly what we did. We placed a ban on the export of crude oil at that time to grow our reserves here at home. With the shale revolution and technological advancements in the energy sector in recent years, though, production has skyrocketed. Then it became abundantly clear it was time to lift the export ban, which we did. Almost 5 years ago, I voted here in the Senate to lift that 40-year-old export ban, and until COVID-19 hit, we were seeing major gains. Last November, for the first time on record, the U.S. exported more crude oil and fuel than we imported. And now that we've reached really what you could call energy self-sufficiency, our Democratic colleagues are eager to impose policies that would send us right back to the 1970s and that Orwellian energy crisis and wreak economic havoc in the process. You know, really, I think Vice President Biden has succeeded in alienating all sides on this topic because he has been flipping and flopping back and forth about fracking bans, whether it would apply across the board or just to federal lands. But Kamala Harris, his running mate, has been abundantly clear and completely consistent. She said last year, "There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking." Well, whether Democrats are talking about a transition, a fracking ban, or the Green New Deal, these proposals will kill the goose that laid the golden egg, our oil and gas industry, and send the economy into a tailspin. They would bankrupt my state with the best economy in the country. A study by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that a fracking ban would cost our state nearly 3.2 million jobs by 2025. The annual cost of living would go up more than $7,000. Unemployment would skyrocket. Tax revenue would plummet. And the pre-pandemic economy that made us the envy of the world might never recover. The only thing to this so-called transition, the only thing that would lead to is a dire economic picture for Texas, and I believe the rest of the country as well, and unaffordable or unreliable energy resources. I want to be clear. I support efforts to drive down emissions. That's why this shale gas revolution has been so good for the environment by reducing emissions dramatically. The United Nations energy-related emissions have dropped by almost 3% last year, largely due to the increased use of natural gas for power generation. But I also support renewable energy. As I said, Texas is the #1 producer of electricity from wind. But even the strongest supporters of renewable sources of energy can tell you right now renewables are not capable of providing the energy that our nation needs. As we all know, the sun does not always shine and the wind does not always blow. So wind turbines and solar panels can't fill the need, particularly with about 270+ million cars on the road and an airline industry, not to mention our national defense, that depend on fossil fuels to run their engines. Last year, renewables accounted for only 17.5% of our total electricity generation. For comparison, natural gas alone accounts for more than double that. While the development and expansion of renewable sources is important and something I support, we simply can't cut our nose off to spite our face by denying ourselves access to really what is a gift, which is our natural resources and fossil fuels. Right now, we have hope that once daily commutes and non-essential travel resumes, more Texas energy workers will be back on the job and our economy will rebound. But if our country were to implement the policies advocated by leading Democrats, particularly their presidential and vice presidential nominee, that hope would altogether disappear. This is not the time, if ever there was a time, to implement heavy-handed, short-sighted government policies like that. Our energy industry is still reeling from the impact of the coronavirus, and our Democratic colleagues' disastrous policies would not make that better, it would make it worse. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I'm glad I was here to hear the wise words of the senator from Texas. I look at our region, the Tennessee Valley, compare it to California. California is moving ahead with a policy a lot like Vice President Biden's. They've got a high goal for powering that whole state on wind and solar and closing their nuclear plants. And what's happening in California? Rates are going through the roofs and they're having rolling blackouts. What's happening in Tennessee and the Tennessee Valley? TVA has very wisely expanded nuclear power so that it's more than 40% of our electricity. Of course, nuclear power is totally emission-free, no carbon, zero carbon, and it's reliable. And it's by far most of the carbon-free electricity we produce in this country. And the combination of that nuclear power and hydropower and natural gas in Tennessee has given us one of the cleanest areas. In the East Tennessee area where I live, I can see the mountains clearly now because pollution control is on all the coal plants. So we need a realistic energy policy, not a fanciful one. We don't want rolling blackouts throughout the country like California has, because they've adopted exactly the policy that Vice President Biden is advocating. Now, Mr. President, I come to the floor to speak on another subject. I want to talk about science and vaccines. The governors of New York and California have announced they're creating their own state review panels to review COVID-19 vaccine data as it becomes available. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said, frankly, quote, "I'm not going to trust the federal government's opinion," unquote. And California Governor Gavin Newsom has stated the vaccine won't be distributed in California until it is reviewed by a state panel of experts. The governor of California said on October 20, quote, "Of course, we won't take anyone's word for it," unquote. Well, Mr. President, every day, Americans take the word of Food and Drug Administration's career scientists and the safety and effectiveness of the prescriptions they approve when we purchase 3.3 billion prescriptions a day. Let me say that again. We take the word of the FDA career scientists every day when we purchase 3.8 billion prescriptions each year. I asked Dr. Stephen Hahn, the FDA commissioner, on September 23rd about the safety of a potential COVID-19 vaccine. He was testifying on COVID-19 in front of the Health Committee, which I chair, and of which the senator from Indiana is a valued member. I asked him, Dr. Hahn, who makes the decisions about safety and efficacy at the FDA? Do you do it? Do career scientists do it? Or does the White House do it, Dr. Hahn? Dr. Hahn replied, quote, "Career scientists at the FDA do it. That's very clear. I'm briefed on all major medical product decisions," Dr. Hahn said. "Overruling a center's decision is a very rare event. I have expressed on multiple occasions my intention, and I've done so during this COVID-19 pandemic, to make sure that these decisions are made by career scientists in the centers." I followed up by asking Dr. Hahn's confidence in taking a COVID-19 vaccine himself. I said, "You referred to this once, but once FDA approves a vaccine, and as we've said today, we're going to have tens of millions of doses ready this year, none can be distributed until the FDA approves it. Will you be willing to take that vaccine, and will you recommend it for your family?" I asked Dr. Hahn. He replied, "Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I have complete and absolute faith in the expertise of the scientists who are terrific at FDA. If they were to make a determination that a vaccine would be safe and effective, I would do that. And I would encourage my family to take the vaccine." Those are the words of the man whose job it is to finally approve any COVID-19 vaccine. But then at the beginning of this month, as FDA was preparing to issue additional guidance on the data needed from vaccine developers to demonstrate safety and efficacy for an emergency use authorization, there were serious questions about whether the White House was politicizing the FDA's approval of vaccines for COVID-19. The FDA had submitted its guidance. That guidance was written by career scientists. Those scientists had decades of experience, and what they wrote was the standards that were going to be used for the approval of vaccines against COVID-19. Then news reports of White House interference came out. It suggested the White House was going to change the FDA guidance, or that the White House was not going to allow the FDA to release its own guidance. Many were concerned about that, including me, Mr. President. The New York Times on October 5th had a big headline, "White House blocks new coronavirus guidelines." And it went on to say, the FDA proposed stricter guidelines for emergency approval of a coronavirus vaccine, but the White House Chief of Staff objected to provisions that would push approval
past election day. That was the New York Times. And Fox News. Trump administration to block FDA guidelines that could delay coronavirus vaccine. That's Fox News. The FDA proposed stricter guidance last month that could prolong the timeline for a vaccine, Fox News said. There were many stories to this effect. I could barely leave my office without some reporter asking me if I was concerned about this, about the politicization of the vaccine review process. So I telephoned White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and I asked him about it. And I said to him, please do not interfere with the standards set by the career scientists at FDA for the approval of a COVID-19 vaccine. Mr. President, the White House did exactly what I urged the White House to do. The White House respected the decisions of the career scientists. They did not change one word of the standards set by the career scientists for the approval of COVID-19 vaccines. So I'd suggest that the governors of New York and California do the same. They should show the same respect to the FDA career scientists that the White House did. Undermining the FDA's gold standard of safety and efficacy by setting up state review panels could delay approval, discourage Americans from taking the vaccine, and cost lives. There is a reason why we Americans rely on the federal government's Food and Drug Administration for the safety and efficacy of vaccines. In 1902, Congress decided, when it passed the Biologics Control Act, that the federal government should regulate vaccines after tragic incidents of children dying from contaminated diphtheria antitoxin and smallpox vaccines. This law charged a federal laboratory that would later become the National Institutes of Health in 1930 with ensuring the, quote, safety and purity and potency of biologic products such as vaccines. Then in 1972, the regulation of vaccines moved to the Food and Drug Administration, to what is now called the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research. FDA, therefore, has almost 50 years of experience to refine the process for reviewing safety and efficacy for vaccines, including what data to look at and how to design clinical trials to prove that the vaccines work and that the vaccines are safe. Earlier this week, the FDA convened independent scientific and medical experts to discuss this. They talked about the development, authorization, and approval of vaccines for COVID-19. This is not a new process for assessing vaccines. FDA routinely convenes these type of independent panels to help inform its review. Dr. Peter Marks, head of the Center of Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA, wrote this about the Vaccine Advisory Committee's role on FDA's website. Quote, the committee will hear presentations from experts in COVID-19 disease and vaccine development, as well as from career FDA scientists. Topics will include studies needed to support authorization or approval, post-marketing safety studies needed following an approval, and what would be necessary for ongoing safety monitoring following issuing of an emergency use authorization for a COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Marks continued, there will also be a part of the meeting during which members of the public will have an opportunity to speak and provide input, and this will be followed by a thorough discussion of the issues by committee members. The members of this committee are external scientific and public health experts from around the country, specializing in fields such as immunology, virology, infectious diseases, pediatrics, vaccine development, and vaccine safety. End of quote. This meeting and any other FDA Advisory Committee meeting can be viewed by the public. At the Senate Health Committee hearing on September 23rd, where FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn testified, I reviewed the 3 steps that have to happen before FDA will approve a vaccine. 1, independent experts overseeing clinical trials determine whether there's enough data available for the FDA to review. Number 2, after demonstrating safety and efficacy based on clinical trials, the vaccine manufacturer submits an application to the FDA. And number 3, FDA experts conduct their review and make the final determination whether or not it is safe and that it works. So, Mr. President, in other words, no one knows when the vaccine will be ready to distribute. No one knows that, even Dr. Hahn. And why does he not know it? Because there's this elaborate, independent, public process established by career scientists with not a word changed by the White House that will review the data and then make a decision. Now, because of the work of Congress and the administration, tens of millions of doses are being manufactured. So when that approval comes, whether it's November, December, January, there will be tens of millions of doses of vaccine ready to distribute to the American people. But that approval won't come until the career scientist rules are followed. FDA is considered the gold standard in the world, in part because it is one of the few regulatory agencies in the world that looks at detailed clinical trial data as part of its review, rather than summaries of clinical trial data. The FDA division making the decision to approve or authorize a vaccine for COVID-19 is led by experts with decades of experience, including Dr. Peter Marks, whom I mentioned, the head of the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research. He's been at the center since 2012. Dr. Celia Whitten, the deputy director, has been at FDA since 1996. The vaccine division of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research is led by Dr. Marion Kruber, who has over 20 years of experience in regulatory review and approval of vaccines and biologics. The deputy director of the vaccine division, Dr. Philip Krause, has 10 years of experience at FDA working on vaccines. FDA will also have the advice of independent advisory committees. Mr. President, California and New York, no state will be able to assemble a scientific panel of experts with the same high level of knowledge and experience reviewing safety and efficacy information as exists at the Food and Drug Administration. Democratic governors in those two states should not both be telling President Trump that he ought to follow the advice of scientists like Dr. Fauci, which he should do, but at the same time undermine the review and the work of similar career scientists at the Food and Drug Administration. Vaccines save lives. We have heard testimony in our health committee demonstrating that. Undermining public confidence in vaccine risks not only our ability to combat COVID-19, but acceptance of other vaccines as well. If California and New York can override the FDA on vaccines, what would prevent Republican governors from banning RU-486, the abortion drug, in their states? If that were to happen, I'm sure my Democratic colleagues would cry politics and suggest that if FDA has reviewed and approved a drug and said it is safe and effective, then states should not be able to say that it is unsafe. FDA is the right agency to review and approve vaccines and drugs and medical devices. I would urge the governors of California and New York not to set up their state review panels, but instead focus their time and resources on planning to distribute the vaccine and improving testing and contract tracing, using the resources that Congress has given to states, rather than second-guessing the efforts of scientists at the Food and Drug Administration. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Democrat leader.
ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Well, Mr. President, for more than a year and a half, Leader McConnell and Senate Republicans have refused to take action on the House-passed For the People Act. At a time when our democracy is under siege in so many ways, the For the People Act is a bold proposal that will restore people's trust in our democratic system, a trust that is fading. It is for the people. In order to make a more perfect union, it would shore up our elections from threats from abroad. That's something we've just recently read more and more about. Why aren't we doing more on that? In fact, when Senator Van Hollen a few days ago put on the floor an act, UC, of an act that would say Russia should have sanctions imposed on it if they interfere with our elections, the other side blocked it. I hope they're not following Donald Trump's obeisance to Russia and his view that Putin's just okay. It would also dismantle systematic hurdles that discourage voter participation. One of the worst things the Supreme Court has done, and there are quite a few under this conservative majority, is the Shelby decision, where Justice Roberts, leading the charge, said we can dismantle the toughest protections under the Voting Rights Act. And he said states aren't going to discriminate anymore. And within a year, 20 states passed laws making it harder to vote. That's despicable. That's an awful case. It would help beat back decades of loose finance rules that have empowered special interests at the expense of the American people. We all know about the dark money that's cascading into our system. In fact, Sheldon Whitehouse yesterday asked to make that public, disclose those kinds of contributions when it came to the Supreme Court, where right-wing money pours in to make sure that right-wing nominees get on the court and pull the American agenda so much further to the right than the American people ever would. Well, in general, there's too much dark money, too much special interest money. This would undo it. As election interference remains an urgent threat, as efforts to disenfranchise voters, especially voters of color, young voters, and low-income voters persist, and as powerful special interests continue to exercise outsized influence in our elections, the need for this legislation couldn't be more clear. Unfortunately, the Republican leader has other priorities. Rather than strengthening our democracy, rather than protecting our right to vote, rather than fighting big money or tackling corruption, rather than addressing any of the myriad problems in our democracy that this country faces, Leader McConnell is undoing democracy by rushing through a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court mere days before an election. You couldn't find a more different set of priorities from that of everyday Americans if you tried. I urge Leader McConnell to stop this unprecedented and nakedly partisan process and instead put this important legislation on the Senate on the floor for a vote now. Let's discuss it. Let's debate it. Let's not just reject it at a time when we need to do so much of this. So, in order to proceed to the consideration of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session.
Objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Indiana.
reserving the right to object, I want to go through just a few, and it's really more than a few, it's a lot, of what's embedded in this bill. I would call it the Democratic Politician Protection Act. Let's listen to a few of these things. The Constitution vests primary responsibility in the states to set time, place, and manner of elections. States and localities have determined how to conduct elections for a long, long time. H.R. 1, through a top-down federal approach, completely reverses this long-standing tradition. Rather than strengthening the election process, paves the way for rampant, I think, fraud, abuse, and litigation that diminishes the value of a legitimate vote. By doing these rushed reforms, let's look at the 2018 midterm elections. Polling showed that 92% of voters found their experience very easy or somewhat easy. Why fix it if it isn't broken? It imposes a DC-style election process on the states, requiring all state agencies and federal agencies, including colleges and universities, to automatically register voters, including those that are 16 and 17 years old, preempts state registration deadlines that require same-day registration without verification safeguards, expands the number of agencies that must contribute voter records, even to those who have no experience or expertise in voter enrollment, forcing states to accept a sworn statement as proof of identity instead of photo identification, and record the vote as a regular ballot. It expands absentee ballot availability, requires states to provide prepaid postage for all mail-in ballots. It does so many things that's different from what we've currently got in a system that in most places is working fine. It does not include provisions that require or encourage states to remove inaccurate voter information. It reduces the integrity of voter rolls by restricting the state ability to maintain voter rolls and records to ensure voter identity accuracy. There are no penalties for anyone who is falsely registered, prohibits states from being able to continue routine maintenance on their own voter lists. It also creates numerous private rights of action that pave the way for trial lawyers to sue when the results of an election are not to their liking. It makes the Federal Election Commission a partisan body, politicizes the FEC by changing the neutral, evenly divided 6-member body into a 5-member panel. It makes a new partisan FEC, changes the latitude to determine and interpret the subjective enforcement tests established by this bill. It, in essence, takes what is working and complicates it with a top-down federal system. We should not be rushing into something like this that is that comprehensive. We should be paying attention to the process of getting a bona fide judge across the finish line, which I think most of us intend to do. Therefore, I object to this bill and to moving to the legislative session.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The Democratic leader.
I have another request. As Americans face job loss, health crises, isolation, and enormous daily stress during the pandemic, the risk of suicide has tragically gone up. The CDC found that since the pandemic began, twice as many Americans report serious consideration of suicide. The rate of suicide risk is especially high among young Americans, minorities, essential workers, and caregivers. Well, unfortunately, this is hitting our armed forces as well. The Army's Chief of Staff, General McConville, stated that he sees correlation between COVID and a rise in military suicides. And my office recently received a note, a tragically sad note, from a veterans group in Rochester, New York, about a veteran in their region, 50 years of age, unemployed and struggling during the pandemic. When he stopped receiving the $600 unemployment assistance, he was unable to make his mortgage payments, and unfortunately and sadly, very recently committed suicide. I have no doubt that there are more American veterans out there who are going through the same struggle. Each one is a separate and heartbreaking tragedy. These men and women who've risked their lives for us are taking their own lives, and it's incumbent on us to do something about it. If Congress can implement suicide prevention initiatives, we may be able to make a difference. The House has passed a number of bills to get suicide prevention funding and new resources out to communities. I'm going to ask that we go into legislative session to consider 4 of those House-passed bills. This pandemic has taken so many lives, and we sometimes forget that it's not just those who have contracted COVID. but those who are pushed to unimaginable stress and devastation because of what COVID has done to our economy, our friends, and our way of life. The Senate should be passing these bills and helping out those who may be hiding in the shadows but crying out for help. So there are 4 bills, and I think I will ask for consideration for them en banc. Is that permitted, Madam Parliamentarian? Okay.
I consent.
In order to proceed to the consideration of H.R. 5619, the Suicide Prevention Act, H.R. 5572, Family Support Services for Addiction Act of 2020, H.R. 4861, Effective Suicide Screening and Assessment in the Emergency Department Act of 2020, and H.R. 4585, the Campaign to Prevent Suicide Act. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President,
Yes, the senator from Wisconsin.
reserving the right to object. When the COVID crisis first hit, this body, all of Congress, recognized how serious the situation was, and we acted. We acted in a very bipartisan fashion. We acted in a massive fashion, as a matter of fact. We understood that the American people, through no fault of their own, businesses were shutting down, people were unemployed, and we needed to provide a massive level of relief, and we did that in a bipartisan, almost unanimous fashion. All the needs have not been met. Republicans completely understand that, which is why we spent the August recess in daily calls, talking amongst ourselves, trying to focus and target where the relief is best directed. We understood when we passed the more than $3 trillion of COVID relief in the early parts of this pandemic that our efforts are going to be far from perfect. But they were needed relief, and again, we supported it. But one of the things we were trying to focus on when we're already $27 trillion in debt, recognizing the fact that we don't have an unlimited credit card, that we had to really kind of take the time and hone the next relief package. And so we did that over August recess. And we came together with a very targeted, very appropriate, and still a very expensive package, over $600 billion when you add up the plus up for unemployment benefits, $200 per week, a level that is sufficient but not so high that it actually provides incentive for people to stay on the sidelines and not enter the workforce. I know in my state, in Wisconsin, one of the biggest problems employers have is they simply don't have the ability to attract people off the sidelines when you've got a $600 plus up. We provided additional funding for PPP, particularly for small businesses that have been devastated. Owners have seen their life savings wiped out. That additional over $200 plus up in relief for small businesses would be targeted. It'd be appropriate. It's necessary. Over $100 billion for schools, tens of billions of dollars for additional testing and vaccines, billions of dollars for child care and for agriculture. Again, in total, on top of $303 trillion, which is 14% of our GDP. By the way, a fair amount of that still is unspent and unobligated. So we took a little bit of that that's been unspent and unobligated and repurposed it for this new targeted package. 52 Republican senators have voted for that bill twice. But rather than take yes for an answer, rather than saying, thank you, we will support this levels of relief for the American people, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle just said no. The analogy I've been using is like, Mr. President, I went up to you and said, Mr. President, give me $200. And you kind of looked at me in shock, but because you're a generous individual, you say, well, maybe not 200, I'll give you 100. Because you don't give me the full 200, I go stomping off, I don't even take the $100. Well, that's in effect what our friends on the other side of the aisle are doing. We're offering, and we've supported $600 billion on top of $3 trillion in relief, necessary relief, needed relief, for unemployment benefits, for small businesses, for vaccines, for testing, for education, for child care. It's there for the taking. All they have to do is say yes. And yet they say no because they'd rather have an issue rather than result. Are they serious about helping the American public, or do they just want to play politics? I think the answer is quite obvious. Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The Democratic leader.
the emaciated bill filled with poison pills that my friend from Wisconsin talks about was never intended to pass. In fact, the Republican majority waited 5 months before doing anything while people were suffering. The bill does not contain close to what is needed. And so basically his analogy is incorrect. The analogy would be saying, you have a series of serious illnesses. Let's treat one, because we don't want to pay for the others, even though we were willing to increase the deficit by close to $2 trillion by giving a tax break for the wealthy. So this cry about deficit, when it comes to helping middle-class people, hurting people, unemployed people, people who can't feed their kids, no, it's the deficit. When it comes to giving a big tax break to wealthy corporations and wealthy people, that's fine. So I don't really take the words of my colleague from Wisconsin, much as I respect him, very seriously. Our Republican friends put this emaciated bill on the floor at the last minute because they got such pressure for doing nothing. They know it can't pass the House. They know it's totally inadequate. The greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression, the greatest health care crisis for 100 years, since the Spanish pandemic flu. And our colleagues do next to nothing in terms of the crisis, load it with poison pills so they know it can't pass the House, waited 5 months, and the American people know it. When they're asked who wants to solve this problem, they know that it's the Democrats in the Senate and the House that want to, and the Republicans that have resisted. So there's no question about it. The bills I just asked for are small bills, not very expensive, that deal with suicide. But of course the answer is no again. It's sad, unfortunate, but fortunately the American people will be able to have a real say, not on the Supreme Court justice they're rushing through, but on who will be the next administration and who will do more. And we'll see what their answer is. I'd be happy to yield.
You know, I hear Senator Johnson talk about employers can't find workers. You know, there are 600,000 people in my state that lost their unemployment insurance like that at the end of July. 600,000 people lost $600 a week. And, you know, I go back to March when we passed this bill that was so important. We passed it unanimously. There was one amendment Republicans wanted to this $2.5 trillion bill. It was to strip out unemployment insurance so that those workers didn't get the $600 a week. What are they to live on? 600,000 people in my state can't find work. Hundreds of thousands in Wisconsin, even more in New York, tens of thousands in Iowa and Utah. And what are they to do? We know there's going to be a wave of foreclosures or evictions and foreclosures as people are thrown out of their apartments and their homes. And this Congress continues the Senate just won't do its job. Do your job so we can, if Senator McConnell would do his job so we can do our job and get this economy back on track. Thank you, Mr. Leader.
Add one final thing. The bill that my friend from Wisconsin talks about was totally partisan, which they know can't pass. And then, when Leader McConnell put it on the floor, he filled the tree so it couldn't even be amended. So, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Iowa.
the Senate will soon vote on the confirmation of Judge Barrett to become Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I will be voting in favor of her nomination, and I urge my colleagues to do just the same. As was made clear to millions of Americans who watched her hearing, Judge Barrett has the temperament, the modesty, and the humility that we should all expect in a judge. She approaches cases without bias or personal agenda. She made that very clear to almost every question asked to her by every member of the Judiciary Committee. Most importantly, Judge Barrett understands the proper role of members of the judiciary in our constitutional system of separated powers. That is, a judge should interpret, not make the law. Making law is, under the Constitution, the responsibility of the Congress, not the Supreme Court. She also made that very clear in almost every question that she was asked by members of the Judiciary Committee. Judge Barrett has an impressive command of, and of course, a respect for the law and the Constitution. Clearly from her testimony, she respects precedent, and she practices judicial restraint. In her words, quote, "A judge who approaches a case as an opportunity for an exercise of will has betrayed her judicial duty," end of quote. She went on to explain to the committee her legal method, how she considers statutes in the Constitution, and how she interprets and applies the statutes and the Constitution. Her judicial method is rigorous and exacting, but fair. She testified that she would listen to both sides in every case. She said, quote, "We want judges to approach cases thoughtfully and with an open mind," end quote. When pressed on how she might rule in a particular case, Judge Barrett properly applied what we all know as the Ginsburg Rule. And she did it just like every other recent nominee to the Supreme Court for the last 30 years. When Ginsburg first told the Judiciary Committee that there would be no hints, no previews, or forecasts, and Judge Barrett demonstrated her independence by often repeating Justice Ginsburg's rule. I specifically asked Judge Barrett if she had made any promises or guarantees to anyone about how she might rule in a case. She responded this way to my question: "The answer is no. No one ever talked about any case with me. I can't make any pre-commitments to this body either. It would be inconsistent with judicial independence," end of quote. Then to quote further, "I'm not willing to make a deal, not with the committee, nor with the president, nor with anyone. I am independent," end quote. That quote or similar words were spoken by Judge Barrett to almost every suspicious judiciary member that she might have made some deal ahead of time to get on the Supreme Court. Contrary to critics and their claims about being biased, Judge Barrett is even-handed and has ruled for both plaintiffs and defendants in all kinds of cases. She believes in justice for all in accordance with the law and the Constitution, just like we would expect everybody that's a lifetime appointee to the judiciary to say those same things. We don't see all of them following that practice. She went on to tell the committee, quote, "I am fully committed to equal justice under the law for all persons," end quote. When asked if she will follow the law wherever it leads, she said yes. And then, quote, I have an agenda to stick to the rule of law and decide cases as they come," end of quote. But that wasn't good enough for our Democrat colleagues and their leftist allies. However, throughout the hearings, Democrats and many in the media deliberately misrepresented Judge Barrett's views on the Affordable Care Act. They claimed her critique of Chief Justice Roberts' reasoning in the 2012 ACA case dictates how she'd vote in some upcoming case. So they obviously didn't listen to her when she had no preconceived notions about any case and made no promises to anybody. So the Democrats even pushed the storyline that Judge Barrett signaled to President Trump that she'd support invalidating the ACA if she were confirmed to the Supreme Court. That is nonsense. Judge Barrett made clear that she doesn't have an agenda. She testified, quote, "I have no hostility to the ACA," end quote. Legal scholars critique court decisions all the time, and even when they don't disagree with the outcome. For instance, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, before her nomination, criticized the court's reasoning in Roe v. Wade, but no one claims that Ginsburg didn't support the outcome of Roe v. Wade. Judge Barrett's critique then of Roberts' reasoning was shared by many legal commentators across the political spectrum, including ones on the other side of the aisle. Even President Obama rejected the notion that the Affordable Care Act was a tax instead of a penalty, because that question of a tax or a penalty and the constitutionality or the unconstitutionality of the ACA was what they were critiquing based on Roberts' decision upholding the constitutionality of the ACA because it could be constitutional under the taxing powers of the Congress. So even Roberts didn't pay any attention to the facts that we even had Democrats saying that that penalty for the individual mandate was a penalty, it wasn't a tax. Now, moreover, Judge Barrett's critique of Justice Roberts' reasoning dealt with his interpretation of a provision that's no longer into effect because we did away with the individual mandate. The question before the Supreme Court this fall, then, is entirely separate. So it's pointless to speculate. But Democrats wasted much time on that type of speculation, question after question, Democrat after Democrat on that side when they were questioning her. Senate Democrats want to portray Judge Barrett as a threat to health care. They want to distract from the fact that they recently filibustered a COVID relief bill that would have protected pre-existing conditions. This all then is just a Democrat election year scare tactic, and they're using it almost totally as a reason to vote against Judge Barrett. It happens, though, that the voters aren't buying it. The public is not buying it. A recent political poll shows a majority of Americans want the Senate to confirm Judge Barrett. And a recent Huffington Post poll says, quote, "Voters favor the confirmation of the Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett by a 9-point margin," end of quote. She will be confirmed. That's what we're going to do in just Sunday into Monday. Maybe our Democrat colleagues will finally show up for work, do their job, and give Judge Barrett an up or down vote on the merits, because I think the public, if they were listening in as the Judiciary Committee was voting her out of office, the public knows now that the Democrats boycotted the committee's deliberation. Let's not forget, the same Senate Democrats just 4 years ago declared, quote unquote, the court needs 9 to function properly. Judge Barrett is at 9. Only 4 years later, they don't seem to think so. Judge Barrett is a jurist of honor, of integrity, and of great principle. The Judiciary Committee received a number of letters in support of her nomination. They all praised her intellect, her judgment, her collegiality, and her kindness. And we all saw that kindness as she testified over a 3-day period of time. Mr. President, Judge Barrett won't be a politician on the bench. She'll make decisions as they should be decided in an impartial manner and in accordance with the law and the Constitution. I'm pleased to vote in favor of Judge Barrett's confirmation to be an associate judge of the Supreme Court, and I urge my colleagues to support her as well.
Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
I thank the presiding officer. That sounded really good. Senator Grassley knows that, of course, she was a good witness. Of course, she didn't take positions. Of course, she said, I made no promises. Of course, Judge Barrett said, I'm open-minded. But we all know, cut through it all, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't serve on the Judiciary Committee. I don't think Senator Grassley's a lawyer. I'm not really sure. Maybe he is. I might be mistaken. I apologize if he is. But we all know why she was nominated. President Trump said why she was nominated. President Trump's been very explicit that he wanted a judge who would overturn the Affordable Care Act, and he wanted her there quickly because the Affordable Care Act hearings begin soon after the election. He wanted a judge who would undermine women's decision to make their own decisions about it, women's rights to make their own decisions about health care. He put her on because he knows that she will oppose workers' rights. He put her on because he knows she'll oppose marriage equality. And he put her on, and he wanted her on quickly because he said, I want her there when the election is contested after the election. So, and of course, Senator McConnell, because Senator McConnell always does the bidding, Senator McConnell comes out of his office. I assume he gets many of his marching orders from the President of the United States, comes down here, and 51 spineless, and then there's the senator sitting in the presiding officer's chair. I appreciate his courage, but 51 spineless senators do whatever the president tells McConnell to tell them on issue after issue after issue. I mean, that's the way this place works. That's the corruption, Mr. President, of this place. That the President of the United States said, I want her confirmed now because I want her there to decide the election that I'm going to be involved in. And I want her there now so she can overturn the Affordable Care Act. Of course, Judge Barrett said to the committee, well, I've made no promises, I've made no commitments, I've not cut deals with anybody. Of course she says that. But the fact is, that's why the president nominated her. We know that. And we know that as a result, in my state, I know what the Affordable Care Act has done in my state for the last decade. 900,000 people have insurance that didn't have insurance before the Affordable Care Act. More than 100,000 people under the age of 26 have been able to get health insurance because they can stay on their parents' health care plan. 1 million seniors in Ohio have gotten free preventive care, screenings for osteoporosis, physicals. More than 100,000 Ohio seniors have saved an average of $1,100 on their prescription drugs because of the Affordable Care Act. And maybe most importantly, 5 million Ohioans have a pre-existing condition. That was before the coronavirus. Now that number's higher. 500,000 Americans or Ohioans have a pre-existing condition. But for the last decade, why? Because of the Affordable Care Act, for the last decade, those people with pre-existing conditions, they've been protected. The insurance companies can't raise their rates because of the pre-existing condition. They can't cancel their insurance because of pre-existing conditions. Those are gone. The protection for existing conditions, gone if the Affordable Care Act's gone. Protections for people under 26 staying in their parents' plan, gone under the Affordable Care Act is overturned by the Supreme Court. Now, they couldn't do it democratically. They couldn't do it because the citizens of this country didn't want it repealed. So President Trump goes to the courts to legislate so they can overturn it. We know all that. That's why the comments of my friend from Iowa are just disingenuous. He knows that. Of course she didn't sit in front of the committee and said, yeah, I made a deal. Of course she didn't sit in front of the committee and say, I have strong feelings about the Affordable Care Act and gay rights and women's health. She's not going to say that. I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to know that she's not going to come into the committee and do that. So we know what it's about. It's about repealing the Affordable Care Act. It's about taking rights away from LGBTQ citizens in this country. It's about taking rights away from women. And maybe it's about fixing the election. The president, deep down, the president and Senator McConnell know they're not going to win the election this year. So they want that 9th vote in the court, just in case the president brings a lawsuit and it ends up in the Supreme Court, and the Republicans will have appointed 6 of the 9 justices. That's the game in town. That's what we know is rigged, Mr. President. Now, Americans, so many Americans, millions of Americans are frustrated and angry with the way the president has failed the country during this pandemic. We know 4% of the world's population, 22% of the deaths in the world are Americans. It's not because we don't have good doctors in Utah or in Wisconsin and Ohio. It's because of terrible presidential leadership. President Trump and Senator McConnell they've essentially left the country to fend for itself during this pandemic. The stock market's up, so Trump and McConnell seem to think everything's fine. Stock market's up, what the heck? They're oblivious to the families staring at stacks of bills. They're oblivious to the small businesses that are watching years, often decades, in some cases family businesses going back many, many decades, watching often decades of hard work and investment evaporate in a few short months. But the stock market's up, so Trump and McConnell seem to think everything's fine. Same story over and over again. Corporate lobbyists, their allies in Washington, do whatever it takes to make sure Wall Street recovers. And then they say, oh no, we really can't afford to help anyone else. I hear from small family-owned businesses all the time how they're struggling. They're under incredible stress. They're worried about whether or not they can make rent or make payroll. They've waited on the phone for hours and couldn't get answers about loans. These folks aren't lounging in a C-suite corner office. They don't have high-priced lawyers and accountants who can do all the paperwork. They don't have the lobbyists that line up outside Mitch McConnell's office helping them. They're fighting for their dreams, Mr. President. We know why they're struggling. We know why some of them still can't open their doors 7 months into this crisis because the president and this Senate have so botched this crisis. Again, 4% of the world's population, 22% of the world's deaths, and the president said, I take no responsibility. The president said, not my fault. The president said, I get a 10 out of 10 for I've managed this. President Trump has no plan, never has, to control the virus. He's not even tried. If the president, imagine, Mr. President, if President Trump back in March, instead of lying to the American people, he knew how serious it was. He told his Wall Street friends, and he told that reporter from the Post, I can't remember his name. He told them it was serious, but he didn't tell the American people. He lied to us. Imagine instead if the president worn a mask and stood up and treated us like adults and said to the American public, you know, this is really serious. This could turn into from an epidemic into a pandemic. We've got to fight back. I'm wearing a mask. I ask every American to wear a mask, just like we ask people to wear seat belts and stop at stop signs. I want every American to wear a mask. I want people to socially distance so we can get this fight. But he didn't do any of that. Of course he didn't do any of that. But he also came up with no national testing, contact tracing strategy. He didn't invoke the Defense Production Act so that we could make cotton swabs and gloves and masks and gowns and all the things we needed to do to stay safe. He had none of that. He has no guidance on how businesses are supposed to protect their their customers, no investment of our vast resources to help them do it. We see the results. We saw them in April and May and June and July, in August, in September, and now October. And in fact, in my state, as in many states, there are more coronavirus diagnoses every day, almost every day, than there were a month ago, 2 months ago, 6 months ago. Local restaurants closed for good. The big chains may recover. Communities that already didn't get a lot of investment, brown and black neighborhoods, rural communities, places you can't see from Trump Tower, those places are seeing their homegrown businesses shut their doors and lay off workers. Black-owned businesses have closed at twice the rate of white-owned businesses. We know Latino and Asian-owned businesses are getting disproportionately hurt. Our office hears from so many of these Ohio businesses. We've done a series of virtual roundtables with Ohio restaurants. One Ohioan in Zanesville talked about taking over the family business his dad first started 67 years ago. Business is down significantly. He tries to pay his employees a living wage and give them time off for vacations and family needs. He's a really good employer. He's afraid of letting his employees down. A bar owner in Bellefontaine told us his sales are down. He's worried about his own businesses. When he wrote to me, he didn't just talk about himself. He said he's worried about the ripple effects on the farmers and suppliers and truck drivers and so many others. Now he's dreading the winter when he won't even be able to use the patio. He wonders what he's going to do, what the suppliers are going to do. And it's not just restaurants. The media reported on a newsstand in downtown Cleveland owned by Mr. Patel, an Indian immigrant who came to Ohio and has lived the American dream. Built a better life, started his own businesses, employing other Clevelanders. Now the office building is empty. The food court is closed. His sales have dropped from $700 a day to just $200 a day. He's looking at possible choices unless the government helps. We know we can. We did it in the spring when we passed payroll protection. There are all kinds of implementation problems. The Secretary of the Treasury and the President seem more interested in the big guys than the little guys. Too many businesses went to the front of the line, but despite all that, we hear from businesses that are open today only because of PPP. I heard from Spangler Candy in Bryan, Ohio, family-owned union company. I've toured their plant and seen the great work this, I believe, fourth-generation management team has done. They've seen business drop 70%. They had to take their first federal support in their 114-year history using PPP to prevent layoffs. They kept their doors open. They provided pandemic premium pay for their Teamster employees. A music and arts venue, the West Side Bowl in Youngstown, talked at one roundtable about how they had $0 in revenue in the past 6 months. PPP kept their office staff and stagehands on payroll, but as it runs out, so will their ability to pay employees. Ohio Star Forge, a parts manufacturer in Warren, just north of Youngstown, represented by steelworkers, lost 90% of their business when auto plants shut down. PPP made a difference. They're now back to about 70% of their capacity. Poulter Berry Farm, is a family farm in Fremont. One of their crops is pumpkins. The major pumpkin buyers are amusement parks and fall festivals. Pumpkin sales were down. PPP was helpful, but now they're worried about whether or not they can repay. A-plus Cleaners in Dayton has seen demand plummet. People don't need much dry cleaning when they're working from home. They were able to stay open with an EIDL loan and a CARES Act grant from the county. They're terrified about what happens when the money runs out. We have a bill to get more help to these businesses. The Small Business Lifeline Act, it would extend PPP through at least next spring. It would get more funding to the program so they can get more money out the door to these businesses. It would specifically target help to the truly small businesses that need it the most, including minority-owned businesses. It would extend the debt relief program. It would get help to nonprofits that we know are hurting just like businesses are. As important as these steps are, we just can't give businesses loans and think that takes care of it. When the virus is still raging, the customers don't have jobs. That's why we need a comprehensive bill that actually meets the magnitude of this crisis. This visceral, decades-long opposition from my colleagues to unemployment insurance, I don't know how they don't realize that when 600,000 Ohioans are getting $600 a week, they're spending that money at local businesses. They're keeping the economy going from just a total crevicing. They're helping the economy. They're helping local businesses. They're giving those businesses revenue. But when the $600 just stops, Not only are those 600,000 Ohioans' lives just so difficult, but it makes the businesses that the businesses of which they're patrons, the businesses that they patronize, it obviously hurts them as their bottom line. I think that the stories from these businesses, Mr. President, really get to the fundamental question of what sort of country we want to live in. When we invest in small business, we invest in people and communities, not stock buybacks, not executive bonuses. I know that Senator McConnell and his colleagues here always are looking out for the stock market, always are looking out for Wall Street, always want to hear about stock buybacks and executive bonuses. I know that's their thing, but during a pandemic, I wish it were less their thing. The stakeholders in these businesses, they're not nameless, faceless shareholders. They're the owner's neighbors. They're family members. They're the people we see or used to see at our kids' schools, in the grocery store, and at church. A year from now, do we want to be left with only the biggest companies that follow the Wall Street business model that treats workers as expendable? Ohioans know all too often what happens when you let Wall Street run things and you ignore Main Street. Our communities have watched for decades as factories closed and investment dried up and storefronts boarded over in towns and cities that once were thriving. When people in those towns wake up, they realize the only jobs you can get are at a big box chain for rock bottom wages with no health care, no paid sick leave, no power over your schedule. Is that what we want for our future? We have the resources to fix this. We're the greatest, richest country in the world. Let's rise to meet the moment. Let's pass a comprehensive bill that gets to help to our businesses, our workers, and their customers, and let's get the communities the support they need. Mr. President, in order to proceed the consideration of H.R. 986, Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act, which the House passed with bipartisan support, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative business.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from Wisconsin.
Reserving the right to object. Where do you even begin? That was quite the statement. At some point in time, it just becomes galling to listen to the tactics, the scare tactics, the false allegations, particularly from the other side that gave us the Affordable Care Act, an Orwellian-named bill, if there ever was one. One of the promises made to promote that bill was, in the end, determined to be the PolitiFact Lie of the Year, I think in the year 2013. If you like your health care plan, you can keep your plan. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Millions of Americans lost their health care plan. They lost their doctor. Premiums didn't decline by $2,500 per family. They actually skyrocketed, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times the price because of the faulty design of health care, of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Probably the greatest false allegation that is just offensive. And by the way, to call every member on this side spineless is offensive. We have different views. You know, you're trying to respect the different views if you actually want to accomplish something. But one of the greatest false allegations, they go back to the well time and time and time and time again about this, is that Republicans don't want to protect the coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. Nothing could be further from the truth. That was an argument made back in 2010, and the American people decided that we should do that. Republicans agree with the American people that we want to protect everybody's coverage covering people with pre-existing conditions. We just want to do it where it doesn't cost Americans an arm and a leg. The faulty architecture of Obamacare caused premiums to double, triple, and quadruple because they actually made a very small slice of the American public, 5 to 7% of the people that have to buy coverage on the individual market, that don't have the employer coverage plans that cover people with pre-existing conditions. They made that small percentage of the American public bear the full cost and brunt of covering people with pre-existing conditions. It was not smart. It was a faulty design. The way you fix it is, yes, you require insurance carriers to cover people with pre-existing conditions, not deny them coverage, but you spread that cost over everybody. Just like I mentioned earlier to the Democrat leader, and when I objected to his bill, our friends on the other side of the aisle are far more interested in an issue rather than getting a result. How do I know this? Well, particularly on this issue covering people with pre-existing conditions, 4 times in just the last few days and weeks, they have voted no, first on 2 COVID relief packages, the ones I was referring to earlier, the targeted package that does provide financial relief to the unemployed, to small businesses, to schools, to parents with child care, provide funding for agriculture and testing and vaccines. That also included language to protect coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. Twice in the last few days or weeks, they've also voted no to Senator Tillis's bill that does exactly that, protect the insurance coverage of people with pre-existing conditions. Now, if they were really serious about protecting the coverage of people with pre-existing conditions, they would have voted yes, but they voted no. So I could go on and on. I've jotted down all kinds of points that I'd like to refute, but it's really not really worth the time and effort. Again, let me emphasize, Republicans agree with the American people. This debate is over. We've offered proposals to do just this. We want to protect the insurance coverage of every American with pre-existing conditions. We just want to do it in a way that doesn't cost them an arm and a leg like Obamacare did. So I personally am just getting sick of the false allegations, and that's just only one of them. I could drone on and on about the false allegations made by the other side against Republicans, conservatives, but I'll focus on this. This is a false charge. It's canard. It's a scare tactic. I'm begging the American people not to listen to it or believe it.